My family first came to Sconset in 1886, and this was my mother's side of the family. My dad's side came to Nantucket town at about the same time. Both families were sent here because it was allergy-free, and they had terrible asthma and hay fever. You'd never know it now with all the trees and everything. My mom and dad never knew each other until they met at a yacht club dance many years later, fell in love and got married. And they elected to live in Sconset.
My grandfather started coming in 1896. And my grandparents, he was an Episcopal bishop, Harry Longley, and his wife, Hattie, never owned a house in Sconset. They rented, always rented the same house.
In my early days as a child here in this village of Sconset, where my mother and dad brought me in 1908, and when I was old enough to tread the stage, I was put into the shows at the Sconset Casino.
I was brought here by my family from Baltimore. We were all Southern, except a great aunt had bolted and married and lived in Hartford. So from her time of her marriage, she'd come to Sconset in the summer, where she had a charming little house where the bluff begins. I will tell you that this year, the year I'm talking about was 1913. Up we came, and none of my family had ever been here. My mother was a very pretty, small woman, and she hated the place from the moment we got here. First of all, she didn't like cold weather. She couldn't wear a lot of pretty thin dresses, but my father adored it, so we stayed.
I came to Sconset for the first time in 1923 with my mother and my aunt and my sister, who was 6 years older than I was. And we came because we were friends of the Beinecke family in New York, and Mrs. Beinecke, Katie Beinecke, was my mother's best friend, and we all came to Sconset together.
I was born in Nantucket, so you can say I've lived in Sconset a good 3/4 of my life. My mother was born in Holyoke, Mass. My father was born in Denmark, and he came over here on a ship, landed in New York. He met my mother, and they moved to Nantucket. My mother had family, my grandfather, grandmother, in Codfish Park. My grandfather came here to work for a woman that had a lot of building that she wanted done. So he was her carpenter.
My mother was a bit of a character, I think, and she was best friends with Nan Pearson, who is Wade Green's mother, and they met in Europe as probably in their early 20s. And Mother came to visit Nan at the Wade Cottages. And then Mother came every year, and then she ultimately bought our house from Wade's grandmother, Maggie Wade, in 1943 for $4,000.
My background in Sconset probably dates back to 1924 when I was born. And my early years were, I was mainly on the island just in the summertime because my parents lived off island. My father was a sea captain, and one of my grandparents had a house down below Beinecke, and my other grandparent had a house mainly on King Street, and that's what I remember the most of all. When I was a young man between the ages of probably 7 and 8, up until about 1936.
I've been in Sconset my whole life. The first photo is of me laying on the beach under a black umbrella, and it entitled 2 Weeks Old, so that was in June of 1936.
And we came to Sconset in 1940, my mother and my brother and I. We'd never been here before. We had friends who had a house in Sconset, and they said, oh, you must go up there. My mother and my brother had been very sick all that winter, previous winter, and they thought it would be a good place for them to recuperate.
Well, I was brought here because I was a baby and had malaria, and this was advertised as a very good place for, the air was so pure. At first, my father arrived in a night, in a foggy rain, driven across the island by Mr. Levi Coffin with a great long gray beard, who said absolutely nothing on the way over. My father didn't know where he was going to end up. We had come ahead of time, and so the next day he said to my mother, I think we'll just leave Margaret, the baby, here with your mother, and we'll go away. We might go over to Europe for the summer. And then the next morning after that, the sun came out and he began wandering around, and from then on the family had fallen for Sconset in a very big way. And later on, when my mother was in, perhaps Italy or in California, it was a very bright day, she'd look up and say, oh, a typical Sconset day.